The night was unusually quiet in the small town of Riverside. Officer Chen sat in his patrol car, finishing up paperwork from his earlier calls while occasionally glancing at the clock. Only 2 more hours until his shift ended. The soft glow from his dashboard lit up his tired face as he thought about getting home to his own family. His young daughter had a school play tomorrow morning, and he didn't want to miss it. The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. Dispatch to Unit 247, possible disturbance at 1542 Cedar Street. Neighbor reports unusual noises and crying coming from the residence. No previous calls from this address. Officer Chen straightened in his seat, his exhaustion instantly forgotten. After 12 years on the force, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and something about this call felt different. Unit 247 responding, he replied, already putting his car in drive. ETA 5 minutes. As he drove through the quiet residential streets, his mind processed the limited information. Cedar Street was in one of the older neighborhoods, mostly working families who'd lived there for generations. Not a usual trouble spot. The fact that there were no previous calls from the address could mean anything, but it definitely caught his attention. He turned down Cedar Street, studying the houses as he passed. Most were dark at this hour, their residents long since gone to bed. But halfway down the block, he noticed one house that stood out. Unlike its well-maintained neighbors, this house seemed neglected. The lawn hadn't been mowed in weeks, and there were no seasonal decorations despite the upcoming holidays. A single dim light flickered through a kitchen window, casting strange shadows. Officer Chen parked his patrol car a few houses away, standard procedure to avoid letting anyone inside. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he heard what the neighbor must have called about. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of someone crying, punctuated by what might have been a child's voice. He clicked his radio, keeping his voice low. Unit 247 on scene. I can confirm sounds of distress. His hand instinctively checked his equipment, flashlight, radio, everything in place. But something told him this wasn't going to be a situation solved by standard police gear. Walking up the cracked concrete path to the front door, Officer Chen noticed more details that added to his concern. There were no cars in the driveway, but fresh tire tracks suggested one had recently left. The front window's curtains were drawn tight, but they were mismatched, as if put up in a hurry. A child's stuffed animal lay forgotten in a corner of the small porch, showing signs of recent rain damage. The crying grew louder as he approached the door. He could now clearly distinguish multiple voices, at least one adult and what sounded like 2 children. His heartbreak picked up, not from fear, but from concern. In his experience, calls involving kids were always the hardest. He took a deep breath, centered himself, and pressed the doorbell. The crying immediately stopped, replaced by hurried whispers and the sound of movement inside. Officer Chen positioned himself where he could be clearly seen through the peephole, making sure his badge caught the light from the porch lamp. Police department, he called out, keeping his voice calm and professional, but loud enough to be heard inside. We received a call about some concerns. I'm here to check if everything's okay. More whispers, more movement. He heard what sounded like someone quickly closing cabinet doors, then footsteps approaching the door. Officer Chen maintained his non-threatening stance, but his trained ear caught something else, the sound of small feet scurrying across what was probably a kitchen floor, followed by the quiet click of a door closing. Someone was trying to hide the children. That single realization sent his mind racing through various scenarios, none of them good. But he kept his face neutral, knowing that whatever he was about to discover, his reaction in these next few moments could make all the difference. The lock clicked, and the door opened just a crack. Officer Chen found himself facing a sliver of the face belonging to a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eye darted nervously between him and the patrol car visible at the end of the street. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I'm Officer Chen. Would it be all right if we talked for a moment? I just want to make sure everyone's safe." The woman's eye widened slightly at his words, and he saw something there that he recognized from years of service, a mix of fear and desperate hope, the look of someone who needed help but was terrified of asking for it. What happened next would change not only his night, but the lives of everyone involved in ways none of them could have imagined. The quiet night shift he'd expected to coast through until morning was about to become one of the most meaningful calls of his career. The woman's trembling hand remained on the door chain as she peered through the narrow opening. Officer Chen maintained his calm demeanor, though his mind was racing through years of training and experience. The flickering kitchen light cast strange shadows across the entry, making it hard to read her full expression. "I'm fine," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything's fine here." But the slight quiver in her voice told a different story. Officer Chen noticed how she kept glancing over her shoulder, not in the nervous way suspects do when they're hiding something illegal, but with the protective instinct of someone guarding something precious. He'd seen that look before, usually from parents trying to shield their children from trouble. "I understand," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "Sometimes, though, it helps to have someone to talk to, even if everything's fine." He shifted slightly, letting the porch light illuminate more of his face. "It's pretty cold out here tonight. Would it be okay if I came in for just a moment?" The woman hesitated, and in that pause, Officer Chen heard it again. The muffled sound of a child sniffling quickly hushed. The woman heard it too, and something in her expression cracked just a little. I don't want any trouble," she whispered, but her grip on the door loosened slightly. "No trouble," Officer Chen assured her. "I just want to make sure you and everyone else in the house is safe. That's all." He took a small step back, giving her space to feel more in control. "I'm here to help if help is needed." After what felt like an eternity, the chain slid free. The door opened wider, revealing a living room that told its own story. The space was nearly empty, save for a few scattered boxes and what looked like a hastily arranged sleeping area in one corner. The walls were bare except for small rectangular patches where pictures had once hung, their absence somehow more noticeable than their presence would have been. Officer Chen stepped inside, his trained eye taking in every detail while keeping his expression neutral. The house had the feeling of a place someone had left in a hurry or arrived at with very little. A single lamp provided the only light, its bulb flickering occasionally as if threatening to give up entirely. The woman, who eventually introduced herself as Mrs. Li, stood with her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to take up as little space as possible. Up close, Officer Chen could see the dark circles under her eyes and the way her clothes hung loosely on her frame, suggesting recent weight loss. "Your neighbors heard some crying," he said gently. "They were concerned. Would you like to tell me what's going on?" Mrs. Li's eyes darted to a closed door down the hallway, then back to Officer Chen. "My children," she said, her voice breaking slightly. They're having a hard time adjusting to everything." A floorboard creaked behind that closed door, followed by a soft shh that could only have come from a child trying their best to be quiet and not quite succeeding. Officer Chen nodded understandingly. "How many children do you have, Mrs. Li?" "Two," she answered, then quickly added, "They're fine. They're sleeping." But even as she said it, the door at the end of the hall opened just a crack, and a small face peeked out, a boy, probably around 7 or 8, with curious eyes that widened at the sight of Officer Chen's uniform. "Hey there," Officer Chen called out softly, giving a small wave. The door quickly closed again, but not before he caught a glimpse of a second, younger face behind the first. Mrs. Li's composure finally broke. She sank onto one of the few boxes in the room, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered. "We had nowhere else to go." Officer Chen knelt down to her eye level, maintaining a respectful distance. "Can you tell me how you came to be here?" The story came out in pieces between quiet sobs and nervous glances at the hallway door. They'd fled their old home 3 towns over, leaving behind furniture, clothes, everything that wouldn't fit in their small car. Mrs. Li had found this rental house through a friend of a friend, paying cash from her savings. She'd been working 2 jobs, morning shifts at a local diner and evening cleaning offices, but the money wasn't enough for both rent and food. "The kids," she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, "they're so good. They don't complain even when." She trailed off, looking at the nearly empty kitchen visible through the doorway. Officer Chen followed her gaze, noting the absence of any dishes in the drying rack, any food visible on the counters. His heart sank as he realized what that might mean. The hallway door creaked open again, and this time 2 children emerged slowly. The older boy held his younger sister's hand protectively. They were both thin, wearing clothes that looked a size too small, but their eyes were bright and alert. "Are you going to make us leave?" the boy asked, his voice small but determined. "Mom said we have to be really quiet so we can stay here." Officer Chen felt something in his chest tighten. He'd seen a lot in his years on the force: crimes, accidents, countless difficult situations. But sometimes it was these quiet moments of desperation that hit the hardest. "Nobody," he said, making sure to meet the boy's eyes. "Nobody's making you leave." In fact, he turned back to Mrs. Lee. "I think I might know some people who would like to help you stay." The look of cautious hope that crossed Mrs. Lee's face was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. The children inched closer, still holding hands, but their postures relaxed slightly. Officer Chen reached for his radio, but paused with his hand on the call button. This situation needed more than just a standard police response. It needed a community response. As he looked at the family in front of him, a mother who'd risked everything to protect her children, two kids trying so hard to be brave, he knew his shift wasn't going to end anytime soon. But his daughter's school plague would have to wait. Right now, these children needed him more. Sometimes being a police officer meant following protocol, but other times it meant following your heart. As he began making the first of what would be many calls that night, Officer Chen knew this was one of those times when the badge came with a bigger responsibility. The responsibility to not just serve, but to truly help. Officer Chen's first call was to dispatch, requesting a female officer to join him. Years of experience had taught him that some situations called for a gentler approach, and having a woman officer present might help Mrs. Lee feel more comfortable sharing her full story. While they waited, Officer Chen sat cross-legged on the floor, deliberately making himself appear less imposing. The two children, slowly gaining courage, had settled on a warm blanket nearby. The boy, still protective of his sister, kept one arm around her shoulders. "You know," Officer Chen said casually, "I have a little girl about your age." He nodded toward the younger child, who looked to be around 6. "She's in a school play tomorrow morning. She's going to be a tree." A tiny giggle escaped the girl, the first genuine sound of childhood joy he'd heard in the house. "A tree doesn't do anything," she said softly. "That's what I told her." Officer Chen smiled, warming to the conversation. "But she says her tree is very important because it gives shade to all the other actors." The girl nodded seriously, as if this made perfect sense to her. Her brother's grip on her shoulders relaxed slightly. Mrs. Lee watched this interaction from her perch on the box, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The initial terror in her eyes had faded to a wary exhaustion. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier. "I never thought we'd end up like this," she said, looking around the nearly empty room. "I had a good job, you know. We had a nice house. The kids had their own rooms, with real beds and everything." She swallowed hard. But then, a gentle knock at the door interrupted her. Officer Chen rose smoothly, noting how Mrs. Lee tensed again. "That'll be Officer Wilson," he assured her. "She's here to help." Officer Wilson turned out to be exactly what the situation needed. In her mid-40s with laugh lines around her eyes, she had the kind of presence that put people at ease without even trying. She took one look at the scene and knew exactly what to do. "I don't know about you," she said, setting down a paper bag she brought with her, "but I find it's always easier to talk over a cup of tea." From the bag, she produced a thermos and some paper cups. "And look what else I found in the break room." She pulled out a package of cookies, the kind with chocolate chips that no child can resist. The transformation in the room was subtle but immediate. The children's eyes locked onto the cookies, though they didn't move from their blanket. Mrs. Lee's shoulders dropped a fraction, some of the tension leaving her body at this simple act of normalcy. As Officer Wilson prepared the tea, she chatted easily about nothing in particular: the unseasonably cold weather, the new coffee shop downtown that could never get her order quite right, the stray cat that had adopted the police station as its home. Her casual conversation filled the empty spaces in the room, making it feel less like a police intervention and more like a late-night visit with friends. The children finally accepted cookies, taking small, careful bites as if trying to make them last as long as possible. Officer Chen noticed how they each wrapped their extra cookie in a napkin, tucking it away for later. It was the kind of habit kids developed when they weren't sure where their next treat would come from. With the tea served and the initial ice broken, Officer Wilson gently steered the conversation toward more serious matters. "You've been carrying a heavy load," she said to Mrs. Lee, her voice full of understanding rather than judgment. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is ask for help." Mrs. Lee's hands trembled around her paper cup. "I tried," she whispered. "I went to the food bank last week, but," she glanced at her children, then back to the officers. "They needed proof of address, ID, all these papers I don't have. Everything's back there." Officer Wilson nodded encouragingly. That must have been really frustrating. "The lady at the food bank was nice," Mrs. Lee continued. "She gave us some bread and peanut butter from her own lunch. Said she wished she could do more, but rules are rules." She took a shaky breath. "The kids haven't had a proper meal in 3 days. I've been giving them what I can, but—" The boy suddenly spoke up, his voice fierce despite its softness. "Mom doesn't eat anything. She says she's not hungry, but I hear her tummy making noise." Mrs. Lee's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I could make it work. The first job pays weekly, but it all goes to rent. The second job pays every 2 weeks, and I'm still waiting for my first check. I just needed to hold on a little longer." Officer Wilson reached out slowly, telegraphing her movement, and placed a gentle hand on Mrs. Lee's knee. "You don't have to do this alone anymore. There are people and organizations who want to help, no strings attached, no questions asked." "But what if—" Mrs. Lee's voice dropped to barely a whisper, "what if he finds us?" The room grew very still. The children huddled closer together on their blanket. Officer Chen and Officer Wilson exchanged a quick glance, years of training and experience allowing them to communicate volumes in that brief look. "That's not going to happen," Officer Wilson said firmly. "Part of helping means keeping you safe. All of you." She squeezed Mrs. Lee's knee gently. "But first, let's focus on getting you some immediate support. Food, proper beds, maybe some warm clothes. Would that be okay?" Mrs. Lee looked at her children, the boy trying so hard to be strong, the little girl carefully folding her cookie napkin into tiny squares, and something in her expression shifted. Officer Chen recognized it immediately. The moment when someone realizes they don't have to carry their burden alone anymore. "Yes," Mrs. Lee said finally, her voice small but clear. "Yes, please, we need help." Those 3 words, so simple but so difficult to say, marked a turning point in the night. As Officer Wilson began making calls to emergency housing services and Officer Chen coordinated with local food banks that could bypass the usual paperwork, none of them knew exactly how this story would end. But for the first time in what had clearly been a very long time, there was hope in the small house on Seaver Street. While Officer Wilson continued talking with Mrs. Lee, Officer Chen asked permission to check the kitchen. What he found made his heart sink even further. The cabinets were completely bare except for a half-empty jar of peanut butter and 2 slices of bread wrapped carefully in a paper towel. The refrigerator hummed loudly but contained only a partial carton of milk and some tap water stored in reused bottles. He noticed other details too, the kind that told a bigger story. A child's homework assignment stuck to the refrigerator with a paperclip because they had no magnets. 2 plastic spoons washed and drying on a paper towel. A small collection of free condiment packets from fast food restaurants carefully arranged in a corner. "The kids have been so good about everything," Mrs. Lee's voice drifted in from the living room. "They don't complain even when—" She paused, and Officer Chen could hear the strain in her voice. "Even when I can only give them a little bit to eat." Officer Chen returned to the living room, exchanging a meaningful look with Officer Wilson. The children were still sitting on their blanket, but the little girl had dozed off, her head resting against her brother's shoulder. The boy's eyes were heavy with sleep, but he fought to keep them open, still watching over his sister. "You've been very brave," Officer Wilson said to the boy, "taking such good care of your sister." He straightened slightly at the praise, but his voice trembled when he spoke. "I saved half my lunch at school yesterday," he said, "so Mom could have some. But she wouldn't take it." Mrs. Lee pressed her hands to her face, trying to stifle a sob. Officer Wilson kept her hand steady on Mrs. Lee's shoulder while Officer Chen knelt down near the children. "May I see your room?" he asked gently. The boy nodded, carefully shifting his sister so she wouldn't wake up. The bedroom was small and nearly as empty as the rest of the house. A pile of neatly folded clothes sat in one corner. Two small backpacks, clearly containing all the children's remaining possessions, were lined up perfectly against the wall. The only furniture was a thin camping mat they all clearly shared for sleeping. But what caught Officer Chen's attention were the small signs of children trying to make the best of their situation. A few drawings were taped to the wall at kid height, showing what he assumed was their old house, complete with a swing set and flowers. A makeshift toy car had been crafted from an empty water bottle and cardboard. A storybook from the school library was propped open, presumably serving as their nighttime reading. The boy stood in the doorway, watching Officer Chen's reaction. "I told my sister we're camping," he said quietly. "Like that time we went to the state park. She was scared of sleeping on the floor at first, but I told her camping is an adventure." Officer Chen had to turn away for a moment, using the pretense of examining another drawing to compose himself. In his 12 years on the force, he'd seen many difficult situations, but there was something about a child forced to be this strong that hit particularly hard. When he turned back, the boy was swaying slightly with exhaustion. "You must be tired," Officer Chen said. "Why don't we get you and your sister somewhere more comfortable to sleep tonight?" But the boy looked toward the living room, worry crossing his face. "Your mom will be right there with you," Officer Chen assured him. "Officer Wilson knows a place where you can all stay together, with real beds and warm blankets. Would that be okay?" The boy seemed to consider this carefully before nodding. "Can I bring our drawings?" "Of course, we'll bring everything you want to take." Back in the living room, Officer Wilson had made progress. A women's shelter had space for the family, private room, food, counseling services, and most importantly, security. They could go tonight. A van was already on the way. Mrs. Lee was helping her daughter put on a worn sweater, but hands gentle despite their trembling. The little girl had woken up confused but calm, trusting her mother's assurances that everything was okay. As they waited for the van, Officer Chen noticed the boy trying to gather their few possessions while barely keeping his eyes open. "Here, let me help," he offered, carefully taking down the drawings and placing them in one of the backpacks. "Officer Chen?" the boy asked suddenly, his voice small. "Yes. Are we going to be okay?" Officer Chen paused in his packing, turning to look directly at the child. In that moment, he saw not just a boy who had been forced to grow up too fast, but also a kid who still needed reassurance that the world could be safe and good. "Yes," he said firmly, "you're going to be okay. All of you. I promise." The sound of a van pulling up outside broke the moment. Officer Wilson had already called ahead to the shelter, making sure they knew to expect a family who needed extra care and support. As they helped gather the few belongings and walked toward the door, Mrs. Lee suddenly stopped. "I never thought," she started, then had to take a deep breath. "I never thought I'd be grateful for someone calling the police about us. But thank you. Both of you. I didn't know how to ask for help, and I was so scared, but—" "You don't have to explain," Officer Wilson said gently. "You did the hardest part already, keeping your children safe. Now let us help with the rest." As they walked to the van under the streetlights, Officer Chen noticed how the boy had finally let his sister take the lead, his shoulders relaxing as if letting go of a weight he carried for far too long. Sometimes the biggest victories in police work weren't about catching bad guys or solving crimes. Sometimes they were about being there at the right moment, when a family gathering their last bits of courage needed someone to show them a way forward. The women's shelter was a converted Victorian house, its windows warm with light even at this late hour. As the van pulled up, Officer Chen noticed how Mrs. Lee's grip tightened on her children's hands. Change, even positive change, can be scary when you've been through trauma. The shelter's night coordinator, a gentle-voiced woman with silver hair, met them at the door. She had the kind of face that made you feel like everything would be all right, even when the world seemed to be falling apart. "We've got your room ready," she said, speaking directly to Mrs. Lee. "There's fresh bedding, towels, and some clean pajamas for everyone. The kitchen's always open, and we made sure to leave out some midnight snacks, just in case anyone's hungry." The little girl's eyes widened at the mention of snacks, though she tried to hide it. Her brother stood close to their mother, taking in every detail of their new surroundings with cautious curiosity. As the coordinator led them upstairs, Officer Wilson quietly explained the shelter's security measures: keep at entry, 24-hour staff, security cameras covering all entrances. She could see some of the tension leave Mrs. Lee's shoulders with each detail. Their room was simple but clean, with 2 real beds and a small dresser. Someone had placed a stuffed teddy bear on each of the pillows. The little girl reached for one hesitantly, looking to her mother for permission. "Go ahead, sweetie," Mrs. Lee whispered. "It's okay." While the children explored their new space, the coordinator gently suggested that Officer Wilson might like to help Mrs. Lee fill out some initial paperwork. It was a careful way of creating space for a more private conversation. Sitting at a small table in the shelter's office, with a cup of hot tea warming her hands, Mrs. Lee finally began to share her story. Her voice was quiet but grew stronger as she spoke, as if each word released was lifting a weight she'd carried for too long. "We had a good life, you know," she began. "I was an accountant at a small firm. The kids were in a good school. We had family dinners every night, weekend trips to the park." She twisted the paper cup in her hands. But things started changing slowly. So slowly I almost didn't notice at first. Officer Wilson listened patiently as Mrs. Lee described how her husband's behavior had shifted over time. How the loving father she'd married gradually became controlling, then frightening. How money started disappearing from their accounts. How he'd lose his temper over smaller and smaller things. The night we left, Mrs. Lee paused, taking a steadying breath. He'd been drinking. He started yelling about the grocery bill being too high. The kids were doing homework in their rooms, but they could hear everything. My daughter started crying, and that made him even angrier. She described how something inside her had finally snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. I realized I didn't recognize him anymore. And more importantly, I didn't recognize myself. I used to be strong, independent. When did I become someone who jumped at shadows? While the children were at school the next day, she'd gone to the bank and withdrawn what she could from her personal account. She packed what would fit in their car while her husband was at work. When she picked the kids up from school, instead of turning toward home, she just kept driving. "The kids thought we were going on an adventure at first," she said, wiping her eyes. "I didn't know where we were going. I just knew we had to get away. We drove for hours, stayed in cheap motels until the money started running low. Then I found this rental house through a friend of a friend. Paid cash, no questions asked." Officer Wilson made notes as Mrs. Lee spoke, documenting everything for the restraining order they would help her file. But more importantly, she listened. Sometimes the simple act of being heard can be its own kind of healing. "The hardest part wasn't leaving," Mrs. Lee continued. "It was watching my children try to be so brave. My son, he's only 8, but he acts like he has to protect all of us. And my little girl, she never complains, even when I know she's hungry. They shouldn't have to be this strong, this young." The coordinator brought in some sandwiches, setting them down quietly. Mrs. Lee stared at the food for a moment before taking a small bite, as if remembering what it felt like to eat without worry. "You know what's strange?" she said after a while. "This is the first time in months I've felt safe. Even with everything we've lost, even sitting here in a shelter in the middle of the night, I feel safer than I did in my own home." Officer Wilson reached across the table, offering her hand. Mrs. Lee took it, her grip firm despite her trembling fingers. "That feeling of safety. Hold on to it," Officer Wilson said. "Because that's what you've given your children tonight. You've shown them that it's okay to ask for help, that there are good people in the world who want to help them. That's not weakness. That's incredible strength." From upstairs came the faint sound of children's laughter, probably discovering more surprises in their room. Mrs. Lee closed her eyes at the sound, tears sliding down her cheeks. But for the first time that night, they seemed like tears of relief rather than fear. "Tomorrow," Officer Wilson said gently, "we'll start working on the practical things: restraining order, legal aid, connecting you with job resources. But tonight you and your children are safe, warm, and fed. Sometimes that's the best place to start rebuilding." The truth of their situation was hard, but it was no longer a secret weighing them down. And in that truth there was finally room for hope to grow. Officer Chen didn't end his shift that morning when he was supposed to. Instead, he sat in his patrol car outside the shelter, making call after call on his personal phone. His daughter's school play would be starting soon, but she was old enough to understand why Dad couldn't be there today. Some things were more important. His first call was to his wife, who worked at the local elementary school as a counselor. Without sharing private details, he explained the situation. 2 kids would need to transfer schools, and they'd need extra support and understanding. "I'll take care of it," his wife assured him. "We've handled situations like this before. The kids will have a safe space here." His next call was to the police department's community outreach coordinator. "Remember that furniture drive we did last spring? Any chance we still have contacts with those donation centers?" By mid-morning, a small but determined network of help had started forming. The shelter's staff had connected Mrs. Lee with their legal aid team. A local nonprofit that helped families in crisis was already working on gathering essential supplies. The police department's victim advocate was scheduling appointments with support services. Officer Wilson had stayed too, well past her shift, helping Mrs. Lee navigate the overwhelming amount of paperwork needed for everything from school transfers to restraining orders. But more importantly, she stayed because she saw how much Mrs. Lee needed someone to simply believe in her. "I keep thinking I should have done this sooner," Mrs. Lee confessed as they worked through another form. "Should have been stronger, should have left the first time things got bad." "Hey," Officer Wilson interrupted gently. "You did it. That's what matters. And you did it to protect your children. That makes you one of the strongest people I know." Around lunchtime, Officer Chen returned to the shelter with his patrol car trunk full of donations he'd collected from his colleagues. Clothes that their own children had outgrown, school supplies, some gently used toys. The night shift officers, hearing about the situation during their morning briefing, had taken up a collection to buy grocery store gift cards. The children's faces lit up when Officer Chen walked in with the first box of supplies. The little girl immediately hugged a soft purple sweater someone had donated, while her brother carefully examined a used backpack that was in much better shape than his current one. "Look, Mom," the girl exclaimed, pulling out a packet of colored pencils and a drawing pad. "Can I draw a picture for Officer Chen? To say thank you." Mrs. Lee nodded, tears welling up again as she watched her daughter settle down to draw with enthusiasm she hadn't shown in weeks. Her son was already organizing the school supplies, making sure his sister would have everything she needed for her new classroom. The shelter's coordinator pulled Officer Chen aside. "We've got good news," she said quietly. "One of our partner organizations has a job training program. They're willing to work with Mrs. Lee's accounting background, help her get recertified if needed. And they've got connections with firms that specifically hire survivors of domestic situations." Officer Chen nodded, relief washing over him. A job meant stability, and stability meant a real chance at a fresh start. Throughout the day, more help arrived. A local church group brought hot meals for everyone at the shelter. A pediatrician who worked with domestic violence survivors offered to see the children for checkups, no questions asked about insurance. The shelter's regular volunteers appeared with extra blankets, toiletries, and warm winter coats. But perhaps most touching was the arrival of Officer Chen's wife during her lunch break. She brought not only school enrollment forms already partially filled out, but also a hand-drawn card from her class. "My students made this when I told them we had new friends coming to our school," she explained, handing the colorful card to the boy. "They're excited to meet you both." The boy studied the card carefully, running his fingers over the crayon drawings and cheerful messages. "They don't know about everything, right?" he asked quietly. "No, honey," Officer Chen's wife assured him. "They just know they're getting new classmates who like drawing and reading just like them." Later that afternoon, as Officer Chen finally prepared to head home, he saw the little girl's finished drawing. She had depicted their whole group, the police officers, the shelter staff, her family, all holding hands in front of what looked like a rainbow-colored house. "That's us now," she explained proudly. "And see? Everyone's smiling." Her brother looked at the drawing and then at his mother. "Are we really going to be okay?" he asked, echoing his question from the night before. Mrs. Lee pulled both her children close. "Yes," she said, and this time her voice was steady. "We're going to be okay. We've got help now. We've got people on our side." Officer Chen watched them for a moment before quietly stepping out. In his 12 years on the force, he'd learned that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions: a concerned neighbor making a call, an officer taking the time to listen, a community coming together to support strangers in need. As he drove home, exhausted but satisfied, he thought about how many people had stepped up to help once they knew help was needed. Sometimes people just need to know it's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to accept it when it's offered. That's not weakness, it's how communities become stronger. 6 months had passed since that night on Cedar Street. Officer Chen sat in his patrol car, parked outside a small apartment building, checking his watch. School would be letting out soon, and he'd promised to stop by if he was in the neighborhood. This wasn't part of his official duties, but it had become a regular part of his routine. The sound of children's laughter made him look up. The boy and his sister were walking home from their new school, accompanied by their mother. They looked different now, healthier, happier, more at ease in their own skin. The little girl skipped along, proudly wearing her purple backpack, while her brother chatted animatedly about something that had happened in class. Mrs. Lee spotted the patrol car and waved. She looked different too, standing straighter, dressed in business casual clothes from her new job at a local accounting firm. The haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by quiet confidence. "Officer Chen," the little girl called out, running toward the car. "Did you come to see my art? It got picked for the school display." "Of course I did," he smiled, stepping out of the car. "I heard all about it from Mrs. Chen. She says you're becoming quite the artist." The boy approached more casually, trying to act cool but couldn't hide his own excitement. "I got an A on my science project," he mentioned, attempting to sound casual. "The one you helped me research about police forensics." "That's fantastic." Officer Chen high-fived him. "I knew you'd knock it out of the park." Mrs. Lee unlocked the door to their small but well-kept apartment. It wasn't fancy, but it was filled with signs of a real home. Children's artwork on the walls, school books on the table, the smell of a home-cooked meal in the slow cooker. "The shelter's job program really came through," she told Officer Chen as the children rushed to get their things to show him. "The firm I'm working for, they understand my situation. They're even flexible with my hours so I can drop off and pick up the kids from school myself." The apartment's living room was modestly furnished with donations that had poured in from the community over the past months. The old camping mat had been replaced by proper beds. The kitchen cabinets were stocked with food. A small desk in the corner held Mrs. Lee's laptop, where she worked on rebuilding her accounting certifications in the evenings. Officer Wilson stopped by last week, Mrs. Lee mentioned, preparing after-school snacks for the kids. She says the restraining order is working well, no attempts at contact. Officer Chen nodded. The legal system had worked as it should this time, providing the protection the family needed to rebuild their lives. The little girl returned with her artwork, a colorful scene of their new apartment building with various people coming and going. "See? That's Mrs. Chen bringing us cookies, and that's Officer Wilson visiting. And that's our neighbors who help watch us sometimes when Mom has late meetings." Her brother added, "And that's my friend from school. He's coming over tomorrow to work on our history project. Mom said it was okay." The simple normalcy of these statements, having friends over, doing homework, making plans, showed how far they'd come. These were the ordinary moments that had seemed impossible 6 months ago. Mrs. Lee watched her children with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "Sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed," she said quietly to Officer Chen. "The kids are doing so well in school. The nightmares have mostly stopped. My daughter laughs again, real laughs, not the quiet ones she used to hide." She glanced around their apartment, then continued, "We're not just surviving anymore. We're living, really living. And it all started because someone cared enough to make that call, and because you and Officer Wilson cared enough to look deeper than just a routine check." The boy had set up his science project on the kitchen table, a carefully constructed presentation about how police solve crimes using evidence. "Officer Chen, can you explain to Mom about fingerprint analysis again? She didn't believe me when I told her about the powder thing." "Actually," Officer Chen smiled, "why don't you explain it? You're the expert now." The boy straightened up, confidence shining in his eyes as he began teaching his mother about forensic science. His sister continued working on her latest art project, humming softly to herself. The scene was so different from that night 6 months ago, proof that with the right support, lives really could change for the better. As Officer Chen prepared to leave for his patrol, the little girl handed him a new drawing. "This is for your daughter," she said. because she let you miss her play to help us that night. The drawing showed two families holding hands under a bright sun. At the bottom, in careful letters, she had written, "Thank you for sharing your dad with us." Officer Chen carefully tucked the drawing into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. In his line of work, there were always more calls to answer, more situations that needed attention. But sometimes, if you were lucky, you got to see how a single night's work could help change lives forever. As he drove away, he saw the family in his rearview mirror. The children waving goodbye, Mrs. Lee standing tall and proud in their doorway. They had done the hard work of rebuilding their lives. The community had just helped provide the foundation. And that, he thought, was what real police work was about, not just enforcing laws, but helping build a community where everyone looked out for each other, where asking for help wasn't a weakness but a strength, and where every person had the chance to write a new chapter in their story.